the time? What would you prefer?
Namis manages that transparently, so
Okay.
don't worry about it. You can keep your camera on.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. Please start.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining the Economic Research Forum and the World Bank Office of the Chief Economists for the Middle East and North Africa are happy that you chose to join us today for this online seminar to discuss the World Bank's latest MENA economic update, conflict and debt in the Middle East and North Africa. The region is witnessing multiple crises, but as the title of this report says, two most important among those crises is that of conflict, with the most devastating conflict raging as we speak in Palestine and Gaza. And the second such important crisis is the debt crisis, as several Arab countries are experiencing enormous, one would even argue, untenable levels of debt, both of which are putting our progress towards achieving the SDGs in great danger and achieving prosperity for all inhabitants of this region in also great jeopardy. We have with us today a number of panelists who will help us understand those two crises, that of conflict and that of debt, and their implications on development in the region. It's a distinguished set of experts on the region, as well as distinguished discussants of what we will hear from our panelists today. I would like to welcome Dr. Roberta Gatti, Dr. Huda Asim, Dr. Federico Bennett, and Dr. Gianluca Mele, as well as our discussants, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi and Dr. Kamial Mohaddis. I will turn the floor in a minute to our panelists, starting with Dr. Roberta, and she comes with an extensive knowledge as Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, extensive knowledge of the region and of development issues in the region and elsewhere around the world. I will introduce them by turn when they start to speak, starting with Dr. Gatti. The floor is yours.
Dr. Noah, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I just wanted to say what an honor it is for us to be here today to engage with the audience of the ERS and to engage with such a distinguished set of panelists. We are here to present the MENA Economic Update, which is a publication that we have we issue twice a year. And the structure of the economic update is quite standard. We have a first section, which is the macroeconomic outlook, and then a spotlight section where we choose themes and we go in depth in them that are relevant for the region at the moment. As Dr. Noah has highlighted, conflict, the impact of conflict was an essential theme for us to address. And we have done that, let's say, as economists. And I just want to sort of indicate that this report by no means comprehends the whole pain that the conflict is putting our region through. However, we try to sort of look at the evidence and identify the channels through which it's impacting the economy of the West Bank and Gaza, it's impacting the region, and it's impacting the global equilibrium. The MENA Economic Update is a product of the Chief Economist Office of the MENA region in the World Bank, but we work very closely with all the country economists in the bank in our region, who in turn work with the authorities for the production of the growth forecast. And this year we had the fortune of working very closely with Gianluca Mele, Dr. Gianluca, who is the lead economist for the West Bank and Gaza, to really understand how the impact of the war was unfolding in the West Bank and Gaza. We have a rich material because, as Dr. Noah had highlighted, we not only look at the here now, but we also look at some of the pre-existing conditions and vulnerabilities that put our region at risk from the macroeconomic side. And so we'll have an in-depth look into the question of debt, which is particularly relevant for our oil importing countries. So without further ado, let me get back to you, Dr. Noah, so that the team can present the material and our discussants can offer their thoughts, and then we can engage with you and the audience. Thank you so much, and over to you, Dr. Noah.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I will turn it over now to Federico, Dr. Federico Bennett, economist at the Office of the Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa. He comes with great and expansive expertise, not only in our region and on our region, but also from the Latin America and the Caribbean region. Federico, over to you and your team, Dr. Hoda Asim and Dr. Gianluca Mele, both of whom work in the lead economists of the World Bank's team, and who will give us different portions of that report that we're much looking forward to hearing more about. Federico, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Noha. Can everybody see the screen I've just shared? Wonderful. Thank you. Well, so first of all, I want to thank you for your kind introduction.
Yes, perfect.
Dr. Noha, and thank you to the ERF for hosting and providing us with a platform to present our report and always facilitating discussions on important topics such as these. Now, just like Roberta did, I want to echo that I want to acknowledge the team whose efforts have led to this report coming to be, and under the expert guidance of our chief economist, Roberta Gatti. The report was put together by Hoda Asim, Gianluca Mele, who are here, we will hear from today, but also Asif Islam, Rana Lotfi, and Ilya Suvanov. And of course, in addition to this office, these authors, the report benefited from the input of presentations to and comments from colleagues both within and outside the World Bank, who are too many to name individually, but for whom we are indeed very grateful. Like Roberta always likes to say, it does take a village. So I'm going to kick off first with the key messages of the report. And the first thing is that in 2023, the Middle East and North Africa region returned to low levels of growth, similar to the pre-pandemic period, with oil exporters and oil importers growing at comparable rates. Forecasts indicate that this will continue into 2024, and this essentially puts an end, at least for now, to what we have been calling the tale of two menaces, and my colleague Hoda Asim will expand on this. The conflict in the Middle East, centered in Gaza, has led to a massive loss of life, and indeed is one of the largest economic shocks in recent history. GDP in Gaza has plummeted by 86% in the final quarter of 2023, and the outlook for the Palestinian economy remains highly uncertain and hinges critically on how the conflict evolves. Now, uncertainty in the rest of the region has also increased after October 7th and remains above that of other emerging market and developing economies, EMDs. However, data indicate that the economic impact of the conflict on the rest of the region has so far been rather limited, such as in the tourism sector, for example. There are potential channels of impact looking forward, like further disruptions to maritime transportation through Suez and Bab el-Mandeb could potentially increase shipping times and raise costs for several countries in the region and globally. Now, like Roberta said, the last part of the presentation touches on one of the key pre-existing vulnerabilities that could potentially be exacerbated by conflict, and that is high levels of debt. Over the past decade, several MENA economies have experienced increases in their debt to GDP levels. And the pandemic, of course, accelerated that accumulation, but this trend actually predates COVID. This is particularly worrisome in the case of oil importers, whose levels of debt are much higher than that of oil exporters in the region. Now, the long and the short of our analysis is that growing out of debt or inflating debt away, which are two paths of curbing indebtedness sometimes discussed in policy circles, this seems to be more difficult for MENA oil importers than for other EMDEs, and of course, oil exporters in the region. Now, before I hand it over to Hoda to go over the macro outlook, I do want to echo something that Roberta said, and it's that the numbers and statistics, like what you will see in today's presentation, cannot possibly capture the immense suffering of the many victims of the conflict. Now, while the economic analysis that will be presented today may come across as cold, it does not mean that we ignore the devastating impact of the conflict on those affected. And so, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Hoda to provide the macroeconomic outlook. Over to you, Hoda.
Thank you very much, Fideh, and thank you, everybody. In the following slide, I will present the MENA region's macroeconomic outlook. Next slide, please. Thank you. In this slide, we see real GDP growth for MENA and other EMDEs in the left panel, and for sub-regional group with the MENA, namely GCC, oil exporters, oil importers, and Egypt since 2020, in the right panel. And the first thing we can see here in the left panel, sorry. I'm sorry, can you still hear me? Yes.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Just 1 second. I'm sorry, I'm just having some issues with my presentation.
Hoda, if the presentation is loaded from the OneDrive, it doesn't usually work on Zoom.
Yes.
So if you have a local copy, that will going through the slides will work, but that's the only thing I can offer.
Yes, I'm having some issues with my screen. I'm very sorry. It's not loading. I'm not seeing anything right now. Just 1 second. Okay, now I can see it. So as I was saying, I'm very sorry for the interruption. As I was saying, in this slide, we see on the left panel real GDP growth for MENA and other EMDEs, and on the right side we see growth for sub-regional groups within MENA, namely GCC, oil exporters, oil importers, and Egypt since 2020. The first dotted lines we see is the average growth between 2010 and 2019. The purple is for MENA and the orange is for EMDEs. Now we can see that MENA region grew more slowly than other EMDEs in the decade before the pandemic. During the pandemic, we see that the MENA region was hit harder and the recovery was slower compared to EMDEs. In 2022, we see that while EMDEs suffered due to higher oil and food prices following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some MENA countries, in particularly oil exporters, benefited. This is evident in the growth on in the graph on the right side, where we can clearly see the tale of two MENAs. And then in 2023, we see a slowdown for many reasons. First, a mechanical base year effect from a record high in 2022. Second, global monetary tightening with high inflation and high interest rate, extreme weather conditions such as a drought in Morocco, Iran, and Tunisia, and of course the OPEC plus oil production cuts, which had the effects of slamming the brake. We can also see that the tale of two MENAs has come to an end, with little difference between oil exporters and oil importers, which we can see from the graph on the right-hand side. Now, for 2024 and 2025, forecasts are operating under the assumption that there won't be any additional OPEC plus oil production cuts and that the conflict in the Middle East will not escalate further. Next slide, please. In this slide, we look at how expectations or forecasts of economic growth have shifted over the past year due to successive shocks. We know that current forecasts reflect current expectation, but that projections are also continually being revised. So when we look at private sector forecasts, that can allow us to look back and see how expectations evolved over the past year. So note that this is not forecast of 2024 economic growth, but rather changes or revisions to forecast of 2024 real GDP growth compared to January 2023 forecasts. Now, we can see that over the past year, forecasts have reacted to different shocks, such as OPEC plus cut, the Saudi voluntary cut, and the conflict in Gaza, which we can see in the lines on the graph. And private sector forecasts for real GDP growth in MENA have been revised downward 0.5 percentage point relative to January 2023. And we can see this particularly for oil importers in MENA and for GCC economies who saw sharp downward revision since the start of the conflict in the Middle East. Next slide, please. One novel thing we do in this report is using individual private sector forecasts to look at the disagreement or dispersion between forecasters, which is often used in academic literature as a measure of uncertainty. So when forecasters disagree, dispersion is high, and that means uncertainty is high, and vice versa. The graph on the left side looks at uncertainty in the last 10 years, and we can see that MENA has had higher uncertainty compared to other EMDEs and high-income countries. From 2015 to 2019, uncertainty in MENA was significantly higher than other regions. And then during the pandemic, we see that uncertainty shoots up for all regions. And then we see a second smaller peak around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, uncertainty had been going down, including in the MENA, albeit at a slower rate. And then we see that uncertainty peaked again for the MENA in the months following October of last year. In the graph on the right side, we take a closer look at the last 12 months, and we can see that uncertainty went up for MENA and EMDEs after the OPEC plus cuts, but they were coming down until October 2023, where uncertainty started to peak in MENA, started to spike in MENA, but decreased for other EMDEs. Uncertainty has also started to decrease since March 2024 for the MENA region. Now, uncertainty was not the only thing affected by the conflict, and I will pass on to Gianluca Melli, who will look at the different channels through which the conflict has affected the economies of the region and beyond.
Very good. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Dr. Noha and ERF for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 10 minutes is two things, essentially. One is to give you more granularity, a sense of what is going on in the Palestinian economy, specifically as a consequence of this tragic conflict that is raging in the Middle East. And the second thing that I'm going to try to do is to give you a sense very quickly of the regional impacts that we have analyzed stemming from the conflict. So let's start from the first, Palestinian economic impacts. Let's be very clear, the economic crisis that we see right now in Palestine is nothing like we have seen in the last few decades, I would say, not even years. The depth, the speed, and the systemic, I would say, significance of this crisis are really unprecedented. So let's start from the real sector. In this couple figures in this slide, you will see basically that the economy in Gaza, this refers to Gaza specifically, the economy in Gaza is essentially annihilated. There's pretty much nothing left. And like my colleagues mentioned before, I'm staying out of the human tragedy of this events, but focusing specifically on the economic side of things. So our reports, we have several, every 2 months we come up with economic updates on this. You can see on the right side of this slide, we have estimated the damage, the infrastructural, like the fixed assets damage. And we are in a range between 60 and 85%. And then there are sectors like, maybe the slide might be too small to read easily, but sectors like health, commercial buildings, or education facilities, basically schools, communication infrastructure, think of the towers for communication. All of these are largely above 70% of destruction or damage. So the level of economic activity that we estimate in Gaza at the moment is in a range of 5 to 10%. That's why I use the word annihilated vis-a-vis what used to be before the conflict. If you look on the left of this slide, you will see that for 2023, Overall, the drop was 24% of GDP, a very, very significant drop for Gaza alone. And if you focus on the Q4, the last part of that same graph, you see that there is this massive drop. That is an 86% drop in Q4, quarter on quarter. Now, for 2024, we're still in June. We're still, not even at the half of the year. So it's a little early to have full clarity on the numbers, but we definitely expect a drop of at least 50% year on year for Gaza, which is unprecedented. For the Palestinian economy overall for 2024, we expect a GDP drop of something between 6.5 and 10%, depending on a number of reasons, depending on how long the conflict continues, depending on the level of restrictions that are in place in the West Bank. But I'm going to go through some of these details more. There's more that I could say about this, but since I only have 10 minutes, I need to run. But if there are questions about growth and the real sector, I can come back to that. Next slide, please. I mentioned the ripple effects on the West Bank and Gaza. This is something that we do not always focus on. We obviously tend to focus on Gaza because of the tragedy, and that is normal. But the West Bank has been importantly affected also by the crisis. This is something that as economists, we need to have very clear. Also because the systemic importance of the West Bank for the Palestinian economy overall is significantly bigger. The West Bank, to give you a sense of like a magnitude, the West Bank represents roughly 85% of the entire Palestinian economy, and Gaza represents 15 to 16% on average, of course. The biggest problem in the West Bank has been the increase of restrictions by Israeli authorities for the Palestinians who typically used to work in Israel and would commute in Israel and back to Palestine. These people have not been allowed to work since the start of the conflict. There is a change in trend in the last few weeks, I would say. So more work permits have started to be re-allowed. But all in all, we estimate at the moment roughly 300,000 jobs being lost in the West Bank alone because of the conflict. This is a very important loss of incomes, of course, and this is the main channel of transmission in terms of ripple effects for the West Bank. So this is what is causing it's a drop of consumption, essentially. It's a drop of demand. This is also why I would like you to have very clear a difference in the type of shocks between the West Bank and Gaza. The story is very different, also strictly economically speaking again. In Gaza, we have essentially a huge supply side shock. Things are not entering, commodities, people are completely still standing, blocked inside and outside. In the West Bank, it's the other. So this is why, for example, price-wise, when we look at the level of prices in Gaza right now, we have CPI skyrocketing over 150%. The level of prices has gone up significantly because it's a supply side shock. In the West Bank, it's the opposite. It's a demand side shock for the reasons that I've just explained. It's essentially incomes being lost because the private sector is losing jobs, and also because the public sector, and this is the second point in this slide, the fiscal crisis, the public sector is suffering severely because of something called clearance revenues. Now, I might not have the time to go into too much detail, but clearance revenues are the various tax instruments. Think of import duties, VAT, all of the tax instruments that happen at the border, at the customs. Because of the Oslo Accords from the 90s, Israeli authorities manage the customs for the Palestinian Authority. And based on those accords, Israel collects these duties and is supposed to remit them on a monthly basis to the Palestinian Authority. In reality, this has not systematically happened. And to make a long story short, since the end of May, Israeli authorities have announced a complete halt in the transfer of these clearance revenues. To give you a sense of magnitude again, clearance revenues represent 2/3 of the entire fiscal kind of income, fiscal revenues of the PA. So it's a huge drop. This is why the PA, Palestinian Authority, as a consequence, had to start cutting salaries. And that's why I was saying it's not just a private sector shock, it's also a public sector shock, because the fiscal crisis is also essentially spiraling out of control. The expenses are very rigid. There's a very, and this is a problem that would require also some reforms, but there's a very high and rigid wage bill, for example. But the reality is that people are not getting paid also in the public sector. So I'm going to have to be a little fast because I think I'm already over time. So next slide, please. This is also kind of a snapshot of what's happening at the regional level. So we were in, so as I just said very quickly, the conflict obviously had massive, devastating effect on the economy of the West Bank and Gaza, both. What happened at the regional level? We studied different channels. What you see in this slide on the left is, and both actually, is tourism. You can see that there is a little bit of a contraction next to the month of November, December 2023. You can see that there's a dip in the curves, more or less at the same time for all countries. But then there is also like a quite quick rebound. The story is that there has been an impact, and we see it. But 2023 was being a year of strong recovery after the pandemic. Probably the first year when MENA was really recovering since the 2020, 2021 shock. So despite the little dip that I've just described, we still have an increase of tourism arrival in MENA of roughly 20% vis-a-vis the pre-COVID period. So essentially, it's a story of a very short-lived shock. And if we move to other channels that we have studied in the next slide, please. We studied, for example, what happened to the shipping industries. You may know that among the regional consequences, ramifications of this conflict is also the increased tensions signaled by the Houthis in Yemen, who have attacked a few vessels, some of military nature, some non-military commercial nature. This obviously had an impact on shipping and industries and value chains. Not the shock that we were maybe expecting. What happened very quickly, since as I said, I don't have time, is that spot prices were affected, but the average consumer price at the end of the day, it was not really affected for a number of reasons, because January and February are months that exhibit kind of soft seasonal demand. So demand is a little bit softer in those months. So this probably helped, but also the shipping contracts were signed before these shocks happened, meaning that the prices had been already contractually defined 2-3 months before and didn't have the time to absorb. So as far as the situation does not, what this slide is telling us is that as far as the situation, despite it did not go back exactly to the same point as before, but it went down a lot, as you can see on the left. So unless the crisis completely gets out of control, we do not expect yet a major effect in terms of regional effects on commodity prices. The same non-result is in the next slide, please, where we looked at things like oil futures. This is the top left, or the gas prices for the European market on the right, top right. And then we looked at the capital markets. So in some cases, you have no effects whatsoever. In some other cases, you see a little bit of a shock, but once again, it's a short-lived shock, which means that the crisis has not really had massive impacts on the region as of today. I would leave it at this by reasons of time, but I obviously would welcome any questions about any of these issues. And I hand over to Fede now for the debt part.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gianluca. The backdrop of the conflict in the Middle East, centered in Gaza, is one marred with pre-existing vulnerabilities. And in the report, we focus on the challenges faced by highly indebted economies in the region. Now, we know from previous research conducted in the MENA Chief Economist's Office that calamities such as natural disasters and armed conflict can raise the levels of debt in the countries involved. In the years following natural disasters, growth has historically picked up and aided in the recovery, in the economic recovery. However, this has not been the case for armed conflict, where growth prospects have generally remained subdued for years. And this gives us the sense that perhaps debt is one of these pre-existing vulnerabilities that could potentially be exacerbated, in particular if conflict were to escalate in the region, which is why we've chosen this theme for the final chapter of the report. And what we do is we place sovereign debt in the spotlight. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but the graph on this slide shows the debt to GDP ratio of country groups. So MENA oil importers and exporters, and EMD, this is emerging markets, developing economies, both oil importers and oil exporters. And it shows the debt to GDP ratio for the years 2013, 2018, and 2023. Now, the gross debt to GDP ratio is a ubiquitous indicator when analyzing public debt. And what it does is it contrasts the stock of debt, which is the sum of all of government liabilities, to economic output. In essence, it captures the ability of a country to repay its debt. And based on this figure, I'm going to make three observations. First is that the level of indebtedness has risen over the past 10 years across emerging market and developing economies. Now, the MENA region is no exception to this, and this includes oil exporters in the region. The second observation that I want to make is that this trend of increasing debt predates COVID. Right? While the pandemic accelerated indebtedness in some cases, right, debt levels were already on the rise before 2020. The third thing I want to point out is that the level of indebtedness varies substantially within MENA. Oil importers in the region hold much higher levels of debt compared to oil exporters. Now, this evolution of debt to GDP ratio can be a little bit difficult to unpack because on the one hand, we have changes in debt stocks, that's the debt part of debt to GDP. And on the other hand, we have changes in the GDP part of debt to GDP. And both of these changes are occurring at the same time. So to help understand and make sense of the evolution of this ubiquitous indicator, we propose a simple decomposition. We break down changes in the debt to GDP ratio into three broad components. The first one relates to changes in the stocks of debt, right? Keeping GDP fixed. If debt stocks increase, we would naturally see an increase in the debt to GDP ratio. The second component relates to the effects of real GDP growth. As an economy grows, so does its capacity of repaying its debt. And so all else equal, real GDP growth will decrease the debt to GDP ratio. And this is sometimes called growing out of debt. The third term here in blue relates to inflation. And in this context, the inflation that matters is the price of economic output. So the relevant price level is the GDP price deflator, right? If the prices of what you produce go up, again, all else equal, it's going to make it easier to repay a nominal given amount of debt. And this is sometimes called inflating debt away. Now, before moving on to seeing whether MENA economies were able to grow out of debt or inflate debt away, and I'll rid you of the suspense right now, they were not. I do want to dig deeper on the potential drivers behind increases in nominal debt stocks, this purple, the first component here on this slide. Using a typical debt sustainability analysis framework, we break down changes in the debt stocks, which was the purple component in the previous slide, now here on the left-hand side, also in purple. And we break these changes in the debt stocks into different drivers. First is the fiscal balance. Fiscal deficits, which is primary deficits plus interest payments, can be financed by issuing debt, and thus this increases debt stocks. The other driver we explicitly account for is the effect of fluctuations in the exchange rate. When part of the stock of debt is denominated in foreign currency, fluctuations in the exchange rate will affect the value of the debt expressed in local currency terms. For example, when the Egyptian pound depreciated, the value of euro and dollar denominated debt expressed in pounds increased. So this green term here accounts for changes in the valuation of the stock of debt that come from fluctuations in the exchange rate. Now, more often than not, when we add up these three terms, the primary balance, interest payments, and the effect of the revaluation due to the exchange rate fluctuations, these don't add up to what we observe are the changes in debt stocks, the left-hand side of this equation. Now, this tells us that there are potentially other factors aside from these three that are coming into play that we are not accounting for. These factors are often grouped together and calculated as a residual, often labeled stock flow adjustments, or SFAs for short. Now, SFAs includes things such as below-the-line items, which are extra budgetary revenues or expenditures. It also includes asset purchases or asset sales, for example, of state-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds, as long as they are accounted for outside of the budget. Now, recall that debt to GDP ratio that we are considering here, it takes gross debt, so it ignores positive asset positions, which in the case of some MENA economies can be sizable, particularly in GCC economies. Now, the graphs here show how these different factors on the right-hand side of the equation add up to the changes in debt stocks, right? And the factors are presented by the colored bars, while the total, say, change in debt stocks is represented by the purple dots. Now, there's a lot to unpack from these graphs, and we do so carefully in the report. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight a couple of observations. First, I want to draw your attention to the graph on the left that looks at the case of MENA oil exporters. The sharp rise in debt stocks in 2020 was driven mainly by increases in primary deficits, here represented by the orange bar. But we see that in the years following, these deficits quickly returned to low levels in 2021 and actually reverted into massive surpluses in 2022, represented by the negative bar, which contributes to a decrease in debt stocks. Note, however, that in 2022, despite the fiscal surplus, debt stocks did not decrease that year, right? We see that the purple dot is still above zero, it's still increasing. And this is likely capturing the fact that many GCC economies did not use the revenues boosted by the spike in the oil price that year to pay off existing debt. Rather, they invested in their sovereign wealth funds, which is captured in the stock flow adjustment term here, represented by the blue bar, which is offsetting, you see, the primary surpluses. In the case of MENA oil importers in the graph in the center, they also saw a large increase in debt stocks in 2020. But unlike in the case of oil exporters, deficits were persistent. And in 2021 through 2023, debt stocks continued to grow at a higher level, at a higher rate than before the pandemic. Lastly, the case of Egypt is shown separately, given that the data corresponds to the Egyptian fiscal year as opposed to the calendar year in the rest of the countries, but also because the patterns look quite different to that of other oil importers in MENA. Egypt has posted primary surpluses since 2018, but has faced a much higher interest bill, which led to a sizable net fiscal deficit. Now, since year 2021 or fiscal year 2021, SFAs have contributed to substantial increases in the stocks of debt, especially in the fiscal year 23. And I should note that the scale for Egypt is larger than in the other graphs. Also note that the contribution of FX fluctuations, as perhaps one would expect, here represented by the green bar, has truly been massive last year. And we'll come back to this in the next slide. Now, with a better understanding of the factors behind the changes in debt stocks, which was, if you recall, the first purple component here, I want to turn back to the decomposition and look at how these contributed to changes in the debt to GDP ratio, the thing that we ultimately care about. Now, in these graphs here, we see how changes in debt stocks in purple, real GDP growth in red, and inflation in blue jointly add up to changes in the debt to GDP ratio between 2018 and 2023, which are represented by the black dots. Again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight a few key observations. First, I want to point out that, as anticipated, generally we see debt stocks tending to rise and push debt to GDP ratio up, as we see the purple bars generally are positive, while the contributions of real GDP and inflation generally operate in the opposite direction, pulling debt to GDP ratio down, and we see that generally they are negative. Now, 2020 is a salient exception to this regularity. As we know, real GDP contracted in most countries that year. And in the case of oil exporters, the GDP price deflator also fell with the plummeting oil price in 2020. Added to a sharp increase in debt stocks, all these factors contributed to a massive increase in debt to GDP for MENA oil exporters that year. In the years following, as oil prices returned to pre-pandemic levels in 2021 and in 2022 actually soared, debt to GDP ratio decreased sharply. and mainly driven by the contribution of inflation, represented in the blue bars. Now, all in all, MENA oil exporters returned by the end of 2023 to a debt to GDP ratio that is close to that to what they had before 2019. Now, things were different in the case of oil importers. As we saw in the previous slide, these economies' debt stocks continued to rise at a high rate in the years that followed the pandemic. And so despite having very high growth, bounce back growth in 2021 and very high inflation in 2022, we see that debt to GDP ratio did not only not decrease, but actually increased further in 2022. Debt to GDP ratio remained well above pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2023. In the case of Egypt, despite notable high growth and very high inflation, we see that debt to GDP levels continue to rise in the years following the pandemic. And so what this does is it casts doubt on MENA oil importers' ability to grow out of debt or inflate debt away. And the key point here is that in order to do so, real growth and inflation must outpace debt accumulation. How debt stocks evolve when growth is high or inflation is high is critically important. And I'm going to wrap up in this slide. In the interest of time, I do want to leave plenty of time for the discussants. But essentially, the last portion of the analysis focuses precisely on how the contributions of growth and inflation relate to changes in debt stocks. And the bottom line here is that growing out of debt and inflating debt away has indeed been harder for MENA oil importers, compared not only to oil exporters in the region, but also relative to EMDEs more broadly. We see that over the past decade, periods of high growth or high inflation have also coincided with periods of faster debt accumulation in MENA oil importers. Almost half of any decrease in debt to GDP attributable to real GDP growth has been offset by increasing debt stocks. And this is 7 times higher than in other oil importing, emerging market and developing economies. When we look at inflation, the picture looks even bleaker. We see that over 80% of the decrease in debt to GDP attributable to inflation was undone by increasing debt stocks. In both cases, the main drivers of this relation were contributions of extra budgetary factors, these SFAs that I mentioned earlier, and specifically the FX revaluation component and stock flow adjustment. This catch-all term that we grouped that grouped all of the unaccounted for factors. I'll actually conclude on this slide with 2 takeaways, which are fairly straightforward. First is that in order to harness the ability to reduce indebtedness with growth or inflation, keeping rising debt stocks in check is a must. And second, to the extent that the factors captured by the stock flow adjustments are truly unaccounted for, debt transparency must be improved, so if nothing else, just to have a clearer picture of what has been behind MENA's inability to grow out of debt and inflate debt away. And so with this, I'm going to stop here and skip the recap of the key messages. I'm looking forward to hearing what our esteemed discussants' takeaways are. So thank you very much. And over to you, Dr. Noha.
Thank you very much, Federico, and the World Bank team. This is an incredibly important conversation now. I'd like to give a chance to our distinguished discussants to share with us their observations. The Q&A section has 7 questions. I want to make sure to let you know I am tracking your questions, and hopefully we'll get a chance to get some answers on those questions from our panelists. But first, let's give the floor to our distinguished discussants, Dr. Ibrahim El-Badawi, Managing Director of the Economic Research Forum and former Minister of Finance and Economic Planning in Sudan between 2019 and 2020, as well as Dr. Kamiar Muhaddes, who is a macroeconomist at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge and a fellow in economics at King's College in Cambridge. Dr. Ibrahim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noha. And I'm really thrilled and very delighted that this report comes really at a time that the region is going through very difficult shocks, of course, most notably the tragic war on Gaza, And I think I would like to really commend the colleagues from the Roberta and the colleagues from the Office of the Chief Economist for producing such an important update at this particular time. I would just like to also mention, even though it was recognized, of course, that in addition to this, what I could call as intergenerational conflict, the Arab or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, they are now in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, many conflicts, country-specific conflicts, especially in socially fractionalized societies, in both the African wing and the Asian wing of the Arab world. And these are becoming almost like a new normal, unfortunately. So I think that would be important to think about this going forward. And they have major spillovers in terms of refugees and in terms of impact on, other, in the economies afflicted by conflicts, but also they have spillovers to other economies. I think in this context, it would be interesting to think also about the magnification effect of these shocks. If we think of conflict or death as shocks, the magnification effect is entailed by looking at the quality and the robustness of institutions for mediating social conflicts in the aftermath of shocks. I think that would be an important point thinking ahead. But let me focus actually on the subject matter of the report itself. I think debt accounting and decomposition I found it most interesting and creative. And I think it's very interesting to provide this conceptual analytical kind of tool in order to underpin the analysis. But I think in terms of policy implications, there are some issues. For example, the issue of exchange rate. In many of these countries, it will be very difficult actually to think about suppressing the tendency of the exchange rate to depreciate because you have parallel markets. And so even if you want to ride out the debt, by suppressing the exchange rate, in the short run, you will be faced with the problem of parallel markets in the short run. And then potentially also, I think it is important to understand that the exchange rate is important for medium and long-term growth, especially medium-term growth, because many of these countries, most notably Egypt, but also Morocco and others, I think they do need to deal with the issue of exchange rate overvaluation as an impediment to export-oriented growth. I think so. This is a conundrum, and I think the only way to solve it really is to probe deep into the fiscal policy and fiscal institutions as really the true elephant in the room. Everything starts. I think the report mentioned that obviously and stressed that, but I think probably there is need to be more emphasis that actually the exchange rate itself, the behavior of the exchange rate, as well as the tendency to contract further debt domestically and foreign debt in order to finance the deficit. And this deficit is accounted for by three major outlays. One is, of course, the debt service itself, especially the foreign debt service. And I think this really raises a question about the role of our countries as members of the global South, and the debate about reforming the financial architecture, global financial architecture, and recapitalization of the MDBs in order to provide more resources, longer duration, longer maturity resources. That would be the only way, actually, and I think that should be an important takeaway, probing deeper into the into the takeaways that the report comes with as a suggestion. The other thing is really to look deep into the political economy of the fiscal policy, because subsidies to the state-owned enterprises, SOEs, debt service, and commodity subsidies. Even though there is significant reform that has happened in a few countries, still this is a major cost component of the budget outlays. So I think, and this requires some sort of a debate, political openness about what needs to be done in terms of preparing the public to bear the short-term costs in anticipation of future reward in terms of welfare and growth. And I think if that thing is not done, it would be very difficult to expect how we can actually make the short-run considerations or pressures in the short run and the longer run, coherent. This is important, I think, because in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, our societies are highly mobilized societies, socially mobilized societies. And so it will be difficult actually to think of economic reform in isolation from a political process that actually open up these issues so that can actually societies reach some sort of an understanding about the importance of reform. But reform alone without growth is austerity, and austerity is effective only in the short run, especially if you, for example, deliberately want to appreciate the currency in order to deflate the debt. It eventually will haunt you in terms of the medium long-term growth, and it also, the socially mobilized societies might not really respond positively to that. So I think I would just encourage actually the authors, perhaps maybe to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of the takeaways from the very interesting macroeconomic decomposition and results that they came up with in terms of the debt dynamics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. As a political scientist myself, I very much appreciate that you're bringing in here the issue of the politics of managing debt and the social impact of managing debt. Not an easy game by any stretch of the imagination. Dr. Kamiar Mohandes, I want to turn it over to you now, and I have to say, try to be as brief as possible. There are very many questions in the chat room that I am going to summarize for the panelists and lump together. I apologize to those who've written them, that they will be lumped and not read out loud as they are, in order to give our panelists a chance to respond. And we'll go slightly over the time. I apologize for that in advance, but Dr. Kamiar, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just make some very few points. I try to be quick. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to read the MENA Economic Update, the April version. I found chapter 3 to be extremely informative, as well as the, I think it was May 22, 2024 impacts of the conflict in the Middle East on the Palestinian economy. So thank you very much for that. And one of the things that comes out of it is the devastating impacts of the Israel's war on Gaza, and this will obviously have huge long-term effects. So what the things that you're showing is obviously brick and mortar costs of this war, and in fact for decades to come, this will have huge implications for economic activity in the country. So just to summarize, I think we have conflicts and we have major volatilities in the MENA region. And every 5 or 6 years or so, we have a similar conversation. So let me just summarize what I think is happening. So volatility is obviously a major problem in the MENA region, whether it's commodity price volatility, whether it's conflict, whether it's macroeconomic volatility because of other countries and spillovers. And I think what you're showing here is that macroeconomic policy has not helped at all. And to give an example, I'm just looking, if you compare the GDP growth volatility in the GCC countries, the ones that are sort of better off, with those of resource-rich economies like Chile or Norway, I know they're advanced economies, but if you look at it, it's 3 to 4 times higher. That says a lot, I think. So the thing I take away from this is that we need better, stronger institutions and much better macroeconomic policies in the MENA region. The other thing that, just briefly, and then I hand it over, comes to me is, if I zoom out, so we're thinking a lot in the short term, if I zoom out, I think there's a big thing that's happening, which will impact not only conflict, not only debt, but also standards of living in the region. And that is actually our commitment globally, but also in the region, to achieving a net zero world. What that means is a 60% drop in oil production, a 45% drop in gas production in the next couple of decades. And obviously that's going to have a
You've muted yourself, Kamiar.
Am I back? Sorry, I don't know how that happened. I don't know where we were, but I was talking about the 60% drop in gas, 60% drop in oil, and 45% drop in gas production in the next couple of decades, which obviously will have huge impacts in terms of debt sustainability, in terms of standards of living, and potentially in terms of conflict in the region. So I think zooming out, these issues that colleagues from the bank have raised seems to be relatively small to the ones that we will be facing. Obviously, I'm abstracting from the tragedy and the war in Gaza. For the rest of the MENA region, I think the issues are just going to be further exacerbated if we are to commit to a net zero world. And then the last point I'd like to make is the influence of China and the Eurozone. These are obviously major trading partners for the region, and the Chinese economy and the trade with China has grown multiple times over the last 20 years. And Chinese economy is slowing down much rapidly than any other, I think, any one of us would expect before COVID. And that obviously had really important implications for economic activity, debt, and standards of living in the region, which is heavily dependent on both exports and imports from China. And same thing in the Eurozone and Europe in general, where we do have productivity puzzle, where economic activity has really been low and is not predicted to pick up, which will have a huge drag on economic activity in MENA. So I think I just stop there and hand over to you for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Kamiar, for that. You've just added one other layer of a bigger picture to the one that was started by Dr. Ibrahim. The job of our team from the World Bank to respond to this is not easy, but they're more than capable of just giving us very quick messages in response to both discussants. But let me consolidate the chat room questions to you all in the following 3 points. There is an issue or a set of questions related to the quality of the data that the bank is relying on, including the satellite imaging that the bank is relying on. There are questions regarding the reconstruction cost in Gaza, if there are any figures that you can share. There is a question related to the debt in Libya in particular, and if you do not want to share it now, you can put an answer to that in the question and answer section for the colleague who has posed this question about debt levels in Libya, to get the answer from you. Same thing for the construction cost in Gaza, if you'd like. But then there are a set of questions that relate to the management of the debt issue that you all mentioned. One has to do with where is the investment in consumption versus in infrastructure, and how does this fit into your story? And there is also a set of questions that relate to the low cost of debt versus the level of debt, and to the source of debt, whether it's domestic or foreign, because all these impact upon your inflating debt solution that you presented to us today. I will turn it over to you. Shall I start with I'll leave it up to you, team, to see who wants to start. And you don't all have to talk, but I see Roberta's hand up. Let's take it by hands up. Roberta first, and let's see who comes thereafter. Roberta, over to you.
Dr. Noah, first of all, thank you to our esteemed discussants for a lot of food for thought, and thank you to you for summarizing so well the question. I have a suggestion. I'll just say two things in reaction to our discussants, and then I will ask Dr. Gianluca to come in on the questions that are related to the impact of the conflict, and Dr. Federico to come in on the questions related to that. And if not, we don't manage to answer everything precisely today, the people should feel free to contact us via email. We're happy to continue the conversation. So on the very good points that our discussants raised, one point that I wanted to make is that I really think that Dr. Ibrahim hit it right. We're not talking about suppressing tendencies to depreciate. As a matter of fact, if we look at the position of the IMF vis-a-vis Egypt, for example, is one of letting the exchange rate float. Is completely the opposite. But this comes with the awareness that there will be an increased cost in debt for all the debt that is denominated in foreign currency. The crux of the problem is really the fiscal policy. And in the case of Egypt, is the fiscal policy that, in our interpretation, has really fueled a debt-fueled growth, so to speak. So there's been steady growth, and I think Dr. Federico put it very nicely in his in the graph. There has been growth in Egypt. There has been a primary surplus, and yet an increase in debt. So there's a question of expenditure has not been kept in check. This fiscal expenditure, which has been mainly in infrastructure, has not resulted in growth that was high enough compared to the cost of financing it. And third, because of what we see in the stock and flow adjustment, most of it, a lot of it happened through extra budgetary means, so below the line. Dr. Kamiar brings up very good point. On the question of Gaza, I think there's a job ahead of us, at least as economists, to really conceptualize how these costs that we see now will have repercussions in the future. And the first thing to do would really to try to think about what happens on the human side. And there's loss of life cannot be quantified, honestly, but there's losses to productivity that are connected to losses in human capital for people. Then it sort of really helps us zoom out. What we see now from sort of future markets then does not speak to a large impact in the future through oil and gas production, through oil and gas prices. However, all the forecasts were built on the assumption that the conflict will not expand geographically. Secondly, we are in the third year of decelerating growth globally, and the world is sort of settling on a sort of lower endemic growth. So it has to be seen how the development long-term in China and Eurozone will have repercussions on our forecast. I need to conclude with a word of being humble. As we have seen, uncertainty increases, and so also the value of our forecast the forecast of anyone who's there in that business becomes more shaky. And I need to be honest about that. Statistically, I think the World Bank has been doing, and I'm not saying myself, but actually the country economists, so all of those who work with our counterparts have been doing quite well. We had a comparison between forecast and actuals, but when uncertainty increases so dramatically, it's a tough job to be in. So we need to be humble and really just look in the shorter term. But let me now turn to Dr. Gianluca to address the question on the West Bank and Gaza, and then to Dr. Federico to address some of the question on the debt. With many thanks again for allowing us to be part of this excellent conversation.
Thank you. So I'll be telegraphic. On the question on the damages, the World Bank, together with the EU and the UN, back in, I believe it was March, we published it. There was an interim damage assessment, IDA report, which estimated the direct damage on the built infrastructure to be roughly $18.5 billion for Gaza. Now, a couple of caveats. This is as of the end of January, so it's by now in June, it's a little bit of an old data. At the same time, the vast majority of the destruction did happen by the end of January. If you remember the slide that I showed, there's a little bit of a plateau from February onward. It doesn't mean that it didn't continue, but it was marginally increasing. The biggest part was by the end of January. It's still a very significant amount because 18.5 billion is roughly close to 100% of the West Bank and Gaza GDP in 2022, 97, 98%. So it's a lot of money. I also want to mention this is not the rebuilding estimates. It's not how much will be needed to rebuild. This is the replacement costs of fixed assets, slightly different. But to have a very quick kind of a non-technical answer, I think the rebuilding costs for Gaza will be significantly higher than 18 billion, significantly higher. We're working again right now with our partners, with the EU, UN, for full damage and needs assessment that should come out as soon as the conflict ends, hopefully soon. Lastly, it was a question about methodology. We utilize essentially radar and satellite-based technology. We utilize high-resolution optical imagery, private satellites. We partner with private enterprises that are specialized in this kind of analysis. We have very high level resolution going to 40 meters by 40 meters, so beyond more than each building. We see within the building what happens in that sense. And then somehow, when we can, we triangulate this kind of data with local sources. It could be NGOs, it could be a development partner who's saying, there are problems in that sense. So we couldn't do it as much as triangulation as we normally do. But the long and the short is that I feel pretty confident about the quality of the data. Satellites tend not to lie. Imagery is bias-free for most parts. There are always coefficients. Among economists, we know that if we change coefficients, the results can change. So economics is not an exact science, but I feel relatively confident about the number. Over.
And if I may come in, yes, thank you, Gianluca. So thank you very much for such great discussions, and the questions also posted in the chat, I think, are very thought-provoking. I'm going to just give a general answer that I think will encapsulate most of the comments and the questions, which is related to the debt part. These accounting exercises that we see everywhere, really, on the evolution of debt, I think precisely the point that we are trying to make is that we cannot think of each component of these decompositions individually, right? We make all of these all else equal statements, right? All else equal, the exchange rate is going to affect debt in this way. All else equal, growth is going to, but of course, in the reality, it's not all else equal. And I think Dr. Badawi makes that point very poignant. We cannot think about these things separately, right? And I think that perhaps it's not as aggressive as a policy message as you would like, but the overall message is that we need to be thinking about the economy as a whole and about how these quantities interrelate. That's where we try to take the accounting exercise one step further in looking at the relation between the different components. and to try to explain what we essentially saw in the data, that why despite high growth, why despite relatively high inflation, we have not seen debt to GDP ratio come down, where according to like all else equal narrative, we should, right? Well, the thing is that precisely one of the questions I think is precisely on point. Inflation is going to come with extra costs, right? And that's precisely what we find. Higher inflation comes with higher deficits, right? Why? Because workforce and other expenditures, subsidies become more expensive, right? So all of these things are interconnected. And at the end of the day, what our analysis was going for is not a specific, political economy analysis of a specific circumstance in this or that country, but rather an overall framework on which we can make analysis, and we centered on the region as a whole, taking a bit of a bigger picture, but stressing the importance of thinking about macroeconomy as interconnected, right? As a macroeconomist, I always encourage people to think in general equilibrium terms, not in partial equilibrium terms, right? Everything is changing, everything is interconnected, and so we cannot think of silos in the economy as independent. I think that based on the questions and based on the comments, that message came through. So that makes me quite glad. But indeed, there is still a lot of work to be done specifically on each country. And at the end of the day, I think it boils down to what we said are maybe not aggressive, but the two main policy implications, which is fiscal discipline is absolutely required, is a must. And if we want to make sense of the data that we have, we need good data. If we want to navigate, we need good coordinates of where we are, what speed we're heading, and what direction we're heading. And so data transparency, especially when it comes to debt, is critically important. And this includes, right, state-owned enterprise expenditures that may be outside of the budget, for example, and other things that perhaps are country-specific and hard to ascertain in some cases. But those are my general questions. I hope I touched at least a little bit on each one of the comments and the questions. Thank you very much, and back to you, Dr. Noha.
Thank you very much, all of you. This has been truly a very good conversation. I have the duty of wrapping up and thanking everyone for staying an extra 13, 14 minutes. There is one comment made in the chat room that I will leave with you because I think it's pertinent given today's conversation. All what has been said about fiscal and monetary policies, as well as the political economy context, the impact on the livelihoods of people, and the international and regional context that is complicating the issue even further, because you've touched on one glaring example of the enormity of the disaster in Palestine, both Gaza and West Bank, but there are several such examples in the region. And you also touched on the enormity of the problem of debt, which cuts across the entire region within the context of very difficult political negotiations that the countries of the region are not ready for, and very difficult regional and international context that makes our potential for growth even more uncertain and more challenged. In all of this, the comment that is in the chat room that we don't have time to discuss today, but I'll leave with you, my very esteemed and respected colleagues from the bank, is the future role of the World Bank and the IMF. You've been through that before in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa, but this region has compounded enormous problems. Your role and that of the IMF are coming back to haunt us. They require a serious conversation and a serious re-evaluation of successes and failures. This is not meant to be a dampening comment at the end of our conversation, but rather a plea for more conversations with you in the days and months and weeks to come. Thank you all very much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for our participants. ERF, you're always right there with the timely conversations in your partnership with the World Bank. Thank you from my side for inviting me to be part of this, and good luck to us all. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.